Good morning. You've had coffee, right? Good morning. And thank you, Mike, for that really nice introduction. But also thank you, David and Betsy and the entire Leadership Center team, as well as the representatives from all the other leadership organizations across this region. As all of us in this room kick things off this morning, I think it's important to pause and realize that in order to have a day like we're going to have today, a chance to learn about leadership, but also to be with leaders all day, comes from all those people working together. Not just to put on this event, but working together on an ongoing basis. So I thank you, and I'm grateful just to be here, but also to play a role. I also find my role just a little bit ironic that I'm the keynote for the general session, and a general is the keynote for the lunch session. But I think it fits too. This afternoon, we'll have the honor of hearing from one of the greatest leaders of our time. Colin Powell has undeniably, effectively, and consistently led, not just in the broadest sense, but in times of great challenge and great change. Just think about what he's done. He's been a leader in a war setting. He's been a leader where he's equal to other senior leaders at the Pentagon and on the world stage at the UN. And I think most importantly, he's been a leader who's been willing more than once to allow his leadership to be supportive, to let the leadership begin somewhere else or move to someone else. This afternoon, General Powell will tell you what that's been like for him personally. What I want to do this morning is make it personal to you, because it is far too easy to think of leadership as heroic, as somehow only available to a few, or that only an exceptional few do it well, and nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is, and especially in an environment like this, that leadership is really a constellation of skills and practices that every single one of us needs, not just you leaders in this room, but everybody on your teams when you go back to your offices this afternoon or on Monday. In truth, and especially in an environment like this, if you want to lead now and deep into the future, there are a couple of things that are really important to understand about leadership in this moment. The first is that regardless of sector, leadership today is about adaptability. Not once, not just a handful of times, but continuously, adaptability as a strategic mindset. And two, adaptability not in the sense of just surviving or getting by, but adaptability in the sense that leads to innovation, to creativity, and to progress. And that kind of adaptability takes many. So in other words, rather than being the role or the ability of any one, as in any one person, organization, idea, time, it takes many, and leadership actually moves. Before I talk more about those two ideas, let me talk a little bit about that environment that I've already twice referenced. It's an environment that in General Powell's world, they refer to as VUCA, which is an acronym that stands for a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, VUCA. And it's not just his world we're talking about. You may or may not be aware of these, but every year, large professional service firms, PwC and E&Y in particular, do leadership studies, leadership surveys, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. Typically, no matter which firm it is, they garner somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 respondents. These are huge. And they don't just focus on a handful of sectors. They gather leaders from dozens of sectors, sometimes dozens of countries. And those elements, I believe, make those surveys uniquely valuable. The reason is that they're not just surveys about what leaders see and what they think and how they feel about the environment they're in. We're getting those messages independent of the constraints of any one sector or any one leader. It's a broad survey of the patterns happening across them. And for the last 12 years, all of those surveys, no matter who's conducted them, have asked one form of these two questions. The first is they ask leaders, what's the environment like that you're operating in now and expect to for the foreseeable future? And the second question that follows it is, given that environment, what's the key skill or strategic imperative that you need as a leader, but also as an organization, to contend with and compete in that environment? Here's the remarkable thing. For more than a dozen years, and multiple service firms doing these surveys, the answers to those two questions have been overwhelmingly the same. When asked about the environment, leaders say consistently, unpredictable. And when asked about the key skill they need to contend with that, this might surprise you, but overwhelmingly they say creativity. For more than a dozen years they've said this. The latest PwC CEO survey, which came out, by the way, just in November, so it's very recent, and it was their 20th, by the way, exemplifies. There were 1,379 leaders who took part in the survey, so again, it was very broad, and they represented sectors and leadership roles as diverse as I described these surveys typically do. And they didn't just comment on the environment being unpredictable. They got down to details. 82%, just think about that for a moment, 82% of nearly 1,400 leaders across sectors said that they were uncertain where their economic growth was going to come from. I find that a staggering statistic. It's basically saying that those leaders and those leading organizations aren't sure how they're going to make money and grow. There were other things that they were uncertain about. The speed of technological change and how that might affect them, a constant shifting in consumer behavior and how to respond to it, social instability, and even the availability of skills. All those things, somewhere between 65 and 77% of those leaders said that they had concerns about that, or that they were uncertain. And perhaps you can relate to a few of those yourselves. To give you a little more context for this environment, and not to pile on, let me turn to the World Economic Forum. These are the folks who have thousands of members across the world, thousands of leaders. And they put on Davos, but they do something more important, I think, every year. Every year they put out what they call a risk report. And they talk to over 1,000 of their members and ask them, what are things like? And then the report talks about what they expect leaders to face in the near future. Theirs was just released 3 weeks ago, and I thought it would be interesting to just share a few choice remarks from it. This is just from the introduction, before they get down into the dirty details of things. And I quote, "As the pace of change accelerates, and as risk interconnections deepen, this year's report highlights the growing strain we are placing on many of the systems we rely on." Let me break that down. As the pace of change accelerates, that's in the same zone those leaders are talking about, right, from the surveys? But they add to that. As the risk interconnections deepen, we're putting strains on the systems we rely on. What systems? Later in the report, they spell those out. They're saying the interconnected systems, not just underlying organizations or sectors or economies, but societies, and for good measure, the environment as well. And what they've included on the positive side is that as leaders, we become remarkably adept at managing and mitigating conventional change and risk. So their definition of that is risk that you can get your arms around. You at least know what it is, you can do something about it, and in theory, you can return towards some kind of status quo. What they've said also is that we are much less competent when it comes to complex risk, the kind that's built into those interconnected systems, the kind that the World Economic Forum believes, and those CEOs certainly believe, is the state of things. Not temporarily, but ongoing. Think of it this way. What they're saying is that this VUCA world isn't just a bug in the system that we have to contend with, it's a feature. When I refer to those surveys and that report, I'm mainly talking about leaders in for-profit, nonprofit, and government. But the same experience has been happening in General Powell's world. and this is interesting, in almost exactly the same time frame. I think that's something to pay attention to that signals we're talking about something larger here. 15 years ago, almost to the day, we invaded Iraq. When we occupied that country, we met an enemy that didn't play by the same rules that we did. Al-Qaeda didn't even care about the rules. Here's where that became problematic. The US military was at the time spending nearly $600 billion to train and arm and support our men and women in uniform based on those rules. So, how would you like to spend a third of your budget? That's, believe it or not, 600 billion was just a third of the budget. How would you like to spend a third of your budget doing that training and prepping of your people and your systems, only to find out that that's not how the market works that you're competing in, that while you were doing all that, the rules changed? At first, the military did exactly what we've gotten used to doing in recent decades, but also deep into the last century. They treated that change as though it was temporary or transitional or something you tweaked at the edges, and then you could get back to something you could call a status quo for a predictable period of time. And they were wrong. And to their credit, they have massively changed the way they've done things, especially in the last decade. They not only have come to call this world in which we all work and lead exactly what it is, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, but they've learned to successfully operate in that world. And you might say they've had to be a little creative in doing so. So a traditionally top-down organization, among other things, they've realized that a lot of the decisions need to be made from the field up or the middle up and not just from the top down. But in addition to that, they've become more fluid in their design of everything, from chain of command to communications to battle planning, but also spending billions of dollars on to make sure that they're actually relevant when they hit the field and that they actually get used. I think what's even more striking is that where they train their leaders, in the academies, they've changed how they're doing things. They're not just teaching history and best practices in a past tense anymore, so much as developing their leaders to adapt to a new reality and a whole bunch of unknowns they know are going to keep coming. Forget about the specifics of what they're doing for a moment. Here's what I think is more relevant about what they and other leading organizations have realized. The first thing is, excuse me, the first thing is that the military hasn't given excuses. They haven't said, this is temporary, or it only affects part of us, or even things like, it's so complex, my time is spent better elsewhere than focusing on the world shifting in this direction. They realize they don't have that luxury, and I don't think we do either. The second thing is that they have taken a good hard look, and listen closely here, at who they are, what they do, how they do it, and most importantly, why. And have reconsidered how those components might come together more effectively. Not just once, this is their habit of doing this now. The third thing is that the military and other organizations, and let me throw some of them, Pixar, Airbnb, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, all of these organizations have not only realized what this environment is, but they see that competing in this environment isn't just possible, which it is, but that it comes down to things that are far simpler and far more fundamental than you might expect. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is share with you 3 of those things that they've realized that have allowed them to compete more effectively in this world. But 2, I want to give you a way that you can do that too. To get to those 3 things they've realized, let's remember that in those leadership surveys, creativity was overwhelmingly the thing that leaders said that they wanted and needed. They also said in those surveys, 77% of those leaders in the PwC survey said that getting innovative, creative people and keeping them was either rather difficult or very difficult. 77% of them felt that getting that skill inside their organizations was tough. They didn't say that just about creativity. At about the same rate, they said it about problem solving, leadership, as in leadership across their organization, emotional intelligence. I know people in this room can relate to that. How do I know that? because when the Leadership Center was planning to put on this conference, they asked you. And the feedback was, we need to hear about creativity and innovation, problem solving, leadership, emotional intelligence, but you added to the list. On top of that, you wanted to hear about dealing with generational workforce shifts, transitional leadership, dealing with change, embracing mindfulness. These are the things you're about to hear about today. What Pixar and the military and other leading organizations succeeding in this environment have learned is that all of those are component parts of something bigger, a much more important focal point, and that's adaptability. I'd like to give you a sample of that too. It's a quote from the CEO of Walmart, Doug McMillon. He talked to Harvard Business Review just last year as well. And he was talking to them about the way he has to think and what he and his teams have to be able to do every single day. And this is what he said. Once upon a time, a company like ours made big strategic choices on an annual or quarterly cycle. Today it's daily. And in this interview, he joked that he even jokes with CEOs, like a friend of his is the CEO of Procter & Gamble, saying that it's really hourly. In order to work in an environment like that and be able to adapt in that way, of course you need to be creative, but you need something more. You need a greater mindset that combines those very things that you came here to hear about. And it needs to be an all-the-time mindset, not an of-the-moment or in an emergency mindset. So in order to do that, in order to keep that going on an ongoing basis, we're not just talking about the mindset of a leader. We're talking about a cultural mindset. Not the responsibility of one, but the responsibility of everyone in any organization. So that first realization is that in order to compete successfully in an environment like this, you have to have a strategy based on ongoing adaptability. And the second thing is, second realization, those leaders who are realizing that, moving towards adaptability, are making sure that their emphasis in what they do and how they do it is in the right place and the right order always, not just annually, not just quarterly. And the key for them in doing that is shared purpose. Don't underestimate or undervalue what that means. This is not rewriting your mission statement. This is a fundamental retooling to gain clarity about who you are, what you do, and why, and then using that shared purpose on an ongoing basis. Let me give you a little data to hopefully shake you just a little bit further to see how important and not throwaway shared purpose is. Gallup did a study in 2016 of US workers, and what they found was that a mere 27% of US employees believe in their company values. That's not much, folks. And 23% of workers, only 23, felt that their work and their work environment allowed them to connect their work to values, no matter whose values they were. What Gallup found was that there was a gap between the desired culture of employees who really wanted their company to succeed and actual culture. But also what they found was that the most successful companies were those who didn't treat culture as a standalone. It was integrated into everything they did and everything that every person in their organization did. More than that, it was defined on things that they shared. And it was defined and interpreted ongoing by everyone as well. And then together, they would translate and express how they could accomplish that shared purpose in simple, actionable concepts. This is why, and I think this is kind of an interesting thing, all of those organizations that I just referred to have reduced their entire organizational strategy to one page. A single sheet of paper. I kid you not. Airbnb famously calls theirs the sheet. They don't share it publicly, but the story is that they not only have it down on one page, they have broken its component parts up, and they've framed them, and they've put them around the room in their main conference room where they meet every day to kick off where they're going and reference those. Is that what we're doing today? Are we after those components of that shared purpose? Is that what guides us here? Every day, it's a habit. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill calls theirs the blueprint for next, 1 page. Like the Airbnb one, it was created by everyone across the campus. They all weighed in on it, and all of them use it when they decide on what they're going to do and when they're doing what they've decided on. It's become part of their language. Pixar's boils down to 3 principles. You could fit them on a 3x5 card. What's the point here? The point is not that 1 page. The point is that the thing that we spend so much time focused on as leaders, importantly, by the way, the processes, the best practices, the job descriptions, the systems, all of those things are complicated. They can't fit on a single page. They're also all things that change. And in an environment of constant change, those things change more often and more dramatically. As important, all of those things support. They're not the main thing. The main thing is that shared purpose. Finding your way to the kind of shared purpose that I'm talking about here, that allows a leader and her team to be truly adaptable on an ongoing, everyday basis. It takes time. It also takes deliberate and purposeful thought. And in an environment like this, that can feel daunting. But it's actually a lot simpler than you think. So before I get to that third thing these leaders and leading organizations have realized, let me tell you how you can approach this. Let me tell you about something called the 5 habits of the mind. And I'll tell you how I learned about it as background. For my most recent book, The Language of Man, Learning to Speak Creativity, I had the honor of interviewing at length nearly 70 MacArthur Fellows. They're the ones who get that so-called Genius Award that's announced every year. It's the only award of its kind given for creativity, and it's independent of sector. And Deb Meyer was one of the MacArthur Fellows that I spoke with. She's the one who told me about the 5 habits of the mind. That's what she calls it, and I think her way is magical, but you see this pattern across all these organizations. So Deb is an education reformer, and what she says is that when she gets the project of turning around a school that's not doing well, or starting a new model school to see if maybe there's a better way, or even when they're just doing smaller projects or onboarding a new employee, they use the 5 habits of the mind as a team, and those 5 habits boil down to 5 questions. And the first one is, how do we know what we know? Think about that. It's an invitation to come back and affirm your assumptions. It doesn't mean you're going to change them, but it says you're going to take a look at them to see if they still hold. Have any of the variables that led to them changed? Have new things appeared on it? How do we know what we know? That habit and that question is followed by the second, which is there a pattern? Because opening up is really important. Looking and seeing whether or not your assumptions still, that's all really important. But sometimes what we see are aberrations. We're not going to change around those. But when we see a pattern, it usually means that we have an opportunity to see a threat that's looming sooner, or an opportunity that's growing, and to address it faster. How do we know what we know? Is there a pattern? And that's, Deb says, is typically followed by some form of the question, what if? Which makes sense, right? If you have opened yourself up, if you are purposely noticing patterns, it's going to lead to a what if. Well, given all of that we've just seen, what if we did this to address our problem, or we pursued this opportunity? So how do we know what we know? Is there a pattern? What if? And then this fourth one is kind of interesting. Is there another way of looking at it? I mean, isn't that what the first 3 habits had you doing? Yep. Because there's always another way of looking at it. And it's not just to revisit your assumptions, but so that that big idea that you came up with through the first 5 habits that you're now falling in love with, you do a gut check on that to see whether it's relevant. How do we know what we know? Is there a pattern? What if? Is there another way of looking at it? And then the most important question of all, who cares? Those first 4 habits are really about moving towards adaptability, if they're habits. But at the end of the day, you also have to deliver. So if all that stuff you're doing to create and adapt and innovate doesn't matter to the people you need it to matter to, or the ones you want it to matter to, it doesn't mean a whole lot. One important thing that Deb pointed out is that these 5 habits are 5 questions for a reason. People who've heard about her success in using them have often tried to turn them into statements, like, this is what we know. Here's the pattern. That speaks to this larger mindset of whether you're open or you're closing yourself off, because as soon as they become statements, they may be correct, but they're also the very thing that starts to reduce your adaptability. So, I want to end with that third thing that these organizations that are succeeding in leading in these VUCA times have realized. And it's probably the most important one in that it allows you to face an environment like this. It encourages you to continue to be adaptable. It helps you find and refine that shared purpose with time. And I think it actually facilitates those 5 habits. And I have to tell you another story to get you there. So at the end of my interviews with MacArthur Fellows, I was in the habit of always asking the same question. And about 9 interviews in, I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Pedro Sanchez, and I got to the end of that discussion, and I said, Pedro, is there a question that I haven't asked you? Or is there anything that hasn't come up that should come up in a conversation like this? And he completely threw me off guard. He said, hey, what do you do for fun? I was so thrown to be asked a question. I said, I like to hike, and I like to kayak, and I like to coach my kids. He said, no. What do you do for fun? That's the question you didn't ask me. Play, experimentation, the willingness to come to your edges and see beyond your assumptions. This was a pattern not only across all the MacArthur Fellows, but across hundreds of successful entrepreneurs that I've known and worked with over 30 years. It's the pattern across the literature around creativity and innovation going back centuries. Play. It's not frivolous, it's fundamental. What's going on right now can feel daunting, but I want to assure you, we're built for this. Not just leaders, human beings. The sooner that we recognize that and embrace it again, as we have done every time we progress, the better we are. The sooner we realize that those org charts and those processes and those systems and best practices, all great things, are supportive things to us, the better prepared and ready we are to embrace this environment. And the last thing is, the more we recognize that that leadership and value creation and progress are not a solo journey, the better prepared and the readier we are to see this environment as the opportunity that it absolutely is. I hope you truly enjoy this day, and as you learn from the deeply wise and talented presenters, remember that you may have just as much to learn, and maybe some more important things to learn, from one another and from those people you return to this afternoon or on Monday. I hope you have a great day.